disease and the etiological factors, and then moving on to the symptomatology and the treatment. So depression, yes, our speakers will be speaking in little depth about depression. So we all know the diagnostic criteria of depression. I don't need to go into detail. So to diagnose depression, we should have at least five of the following symptoms listed here for at least 2 weeks of people going through low mood, anhedonia, lack of energy, sleep issues, biological dysfunctions like sleep and appetite and weight changes, including cognitive symptoms of hopelessness, worthlessness, and guilt, and even including suicidal thoughts. So all this will be discussed in little detail. So some of the key facts I want to highlight the importance of knowing about depression. Major depressive disorder is highly prevalent and very costly medical condition. Costly because it has the impact it has on the personal lives or professional lives to the communities at large, the country and the world is huge. And the prevalence, 1 in 10 patients in primary care present with some depressive symptoms at some point in their life. The lifetime prevalence of is about 16% among uh, residents of US adults, and a 12-month prevalence of about 7%. Female to male ratio is about 3 is to 1. Females have a greater prevalence rate. About 13.5 million adults experience symptoms of major depressive disorder in the past year, and 34 million experience it at some point in their life. 80% of those affected by depression will experience at least 2 episodes of illness in their lifetime. That's another thing about depression. So many times it's not just a one-off illness. People who are vulnerable are likely to relapse and get experience it again and again. So we have to be really careful in terms of how we go about the treatment. So 54% of individuals recover within 6 months and 70% within 1 year. So that goes to show that depression, yes, it is a treatable condition. So we have to burst that myth about depression being a lifelong illness. Many people get better, and within first episode they recover fully. 12 to 15%, of course, fail to recover and develop an unremitting chronic illness. Yes, there are certain vulnerable groups, maybe genetic predisposition, and maybe some other maintaining factors. People go into this treatment resistant scenario sometimes. So we'll also be discussing those scenarios in little detail today. So the burden in worldwide is it's depression is a common psychological disorder affecting about 264 million people worldwide. And WHO states that depression is the leading cause of disability as measured by wild years lived with disability, and fourth leading contributor to the global burden of disease. And by 2020, yes, of course, we across 2020 now, depression is projected to reach second place in the disability adjusted life years calculated for all ages. Today, depression already is the second cause of disability adjusted life years in the age category of 15 to 44. 15 to 40, 44 is the most productive age. That's when you see the working age adult population, kind of establishing their livelihoods and really progressing. So if they start getting affected by depression, you can imagine the magnitude of impact. It can occur at any age, but most have first depressive episode by the early 30s. So an estimated 3 to 4% of, we're talking about India now, the disease burden in India, 3 to 4% of India's 100 crore plus population suffer with major mental disorders. That's across all mental disorders I'm talking about. About 7 to 10% suffer from depressive disorders. So the prevalence of depression is about 9%. Major depressive disorder episode is about 36%, and average age of onset is about 31.9 years in India. It's widely prevalent like any other country. In India, also women have more prevalence in depression. The prevalence rates of depression from India range from 1.5 to 37.74 in various studies. So the highest rates of depression have been reported in the rural compared to the urban population. Yes, the unfortunate thing is recognition and access to healthcare is still a huge challenge in India, and that continues to be a challenge. So I think it's important for all clinicians gathered here to know a little in detail about depression. Like I said, the flow of the event today will be learning about the symptomatology of depressive disorder, neurotransmitters and the circuits involved, the genetic etiological factors, and the neuroimaging part as well. And this is going to be covered by Dr. Chandrasekhar. And the management part, we're going to talk about how do we go about treating depressive illness. Take a look at the holistic approach, not just a pharmacological approach, other psychosocial intervention. How are we going to sequence it? What are the criteria for treatment-resistant depressions, and what are the various guidelines tell us, including the recent updates. So if we have time, we can maybe take up a case and discuss about it. Like Dr. Anusha said, we'll try and keep all the Q&As and comments towards the end of the sessions. We'll just listen to the eminent speakers, and we'll come back and have a little detailed discussion about what we're going to talk about. So with this introduction, I would like to welcome Dr. Chandrasekhar to take us through the first part of the presentation.
Hello.
Yeah, Dr. Chandrasekhar.
Sir, you're audible, sir.
Yeah, audible?
Yes, sir,
Hello?
you're audible, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yeah. Sir, you can present your slides, sir, now.
Slides.
Slides. You can go to the share content, share, choose a PPT. So there is a third icon, share.
Share.
Yeah, share. Other click on, you can choose a PPT, sir.
PPT.
Yes, it has come. It's going to come, yeah.
Hello.
Yes, doctor, it's just getting displayed. 1 minute. Yes, it has come, sir. Make it slide deck, sir. Slideshow. No, I think the file is not opened. You can open the file. Yeah, you can, yeah, that's it.
Next. Hello, good evening. Able to hear?
Yes, doctor, yeah.
Okay. Today, I'll be mainly talking about the biological aspects of depression. Okay. Next slide. Okay. Melancholy, whatever you could sound, try bottom. Next slide, please. Mainly about diagnostic criteria. DSM-5 outlines the following criteria to make the diagnosis of depression. The individual must be experiencing 5 or more symptoms during the same 2 weeks period, and at least one of the symptoms should be either depressed mood or loss of interest or pleasure. Depressed mood must be most of the day, nearly every day. Markedly diminished interest in pleasure in all or almost all the activity, most of the day, nearly every day. Significant weight loss when not dieting, or weight gain or decrease in the appetite nearly every day. Sleep disturbance every day. Sleep disturbance, mainly insomnia or hypersomnia. Slowing down of thought and a reduction of physical activity movement observed by others, not merely by self. Feeling of restlessness or being slowed down. Fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day. Feeling worthless or excessive or inappropriate guilt nearly every day. Diminished ability to think or concentrate or indecisiveness nearly every day. Recurrent thoughts of death, recurrent suicidal ideation without specific plan or suicidal attempt or a specific plan for committing suicide. To receive a diagnosis of depression, these are symptoms must cause the individual clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. Next slide, please. So, first, I'll be just giving an overview about neurotransmitters. Endogenous chemical neurotransmitters are endogenous chemicals that transmit signals from a neuron to target cell across a synapse. They are packed into synaptic vesicles clustered in presynaptic side of the synapse and related and released into the synapse where they bind to the receptors. Neurotransmitters are released following their action potential. Next. So, when neurotransmitter, what is the neurotransmitter criteria? So, the chemical must be produced within a neuron. The chemical must be found within the neuron. When the neuron is stimulated, depolarized, a neuron must release the chemical. When the chemical is released, it must act on the postsynaptic receptors and cause biological effect. After the chemical is released, it must be inactivated. Inactivation can be through a reuptake mechanism or by enzyme that stops the action of chemical. If the chemical is applied on the postsynaptic membrane, it should have the same effect as when it is released by the neuron. Synthesis of this life cycle of neurotransmitters, mainly synthesis of neurotransmitters occurs, then packing and storage of synthetic vesicles, if necessary transport from site of synthesis to the site of release from the neuronal terminal, release in response to an action potential, binding to postsynaptic receptor patterns, termination of action either by diffusion, destruction or reuptake into the cells. So mainly classification of neurotransmitters. It is chemical or functional. Chemical mainly biogenic amines, purines, gases, amino acid and neuropeptides. Functional mainly inhibitory or exhibitory. Excessive neurotransmitters, excitatory neurotransmitters mainly glutamate, aspartate, adrenaline and noradrenaline, histamine, nitric oxide and acetylcholine. Inhibitory neurotransmitters GABA, glycine, adrenaline, noradrenaline, dopamine and serotonin. Inhibitory neurotransmitters reduce or block the activity of postsynaptic cells. Hyperpolarization of postsynaptic membrane, mainly by glycine, GABA and dopamine. Excitatory neurotransmitters, depolarization of postsynaptic membranes, mainly by glutamate, acetylcholine, aspartic acid. So, neurotransmitters are mainly serotonin, noradrenaline, dopamine, chemicals GABA, acetylcholine, and histamine. Okay. So, serotonin decrease in 5-HT1A receptor binding throughout the cortical and subcortical region, reduction in 5-HT reuptake sites, 5-HT mediate endocrine responses blunted, norepinephrine decrease in mesial frontal brain neurotransmission leading to anergia, anhedonia and diminished libido. Dopamine, mainly hyperactive D1 receptor, increased binding to D3 deduction in the striatal region, consistent with CF levels of homovalenic acid. Today, I'll be mainly focusing on serotonin receptors. See, serotonin, the headquarters of cell bodies of serotonin neurons is in the brainstem called raphe nucleus. Serotonin receptors, except 5-HT3, which is excitatory inotropic receptor, all other 5-HT receptors are GPCR. 5-HT1A, 1B, 1D, and 1E, 1F receptors are negatively coupled to adenyl cyclase. 5-HT2A, 2B, 2C subtypes are positively coupled with phospholipase C. 5-HT4, 5, 6, and 7 subtypes are positively coupled with adenyl cyclase. So, these are proposed clinical relevance. Serotonin pathways. The headquarters of cell bodies is, again, I am repeating, serotonin neurons is brainstem raphe nuclei. Serotonin projections from raphe nuclei to frontal cortex, important regulating mode. serotonin projections from raphe to basal ganglia may help to control movement as well as obsessions and compulsions. Serotonin projections from raphe to limbic areas involved in anxiety and panic. Serotonin projections to the hypothalamus regulate appetite and eating behavior. Serotonin neurons in the brainstem sleep centers regulate sleep, especially slow wave sleep. Certain neurons descending down the spinal cord responsible controlling certain spinal reflex that part of the sexual response such as orgasm and ejaculation. Chemoreceptors trigger zone is in the brainstem mediating vomiting especially via 5HT3 receptors. Peripheral 5HT3 and 4 receptors in the gut may regulate appetite as well as other gastrointestinal functions such as gastrointestinal motility. Serotonin inhibits dopamine release both at the level of dopamine cell bodies and at the level of dopamine axon terminals. In nigrostriatal dopamine pathway, serotonin exerts powerful control of dopamine release. It occurs at two levels, mainly in the raphe nucleus and in the periphery. At presynaptic terminal, along with 5HT1D, there is alpha-2 adrenergic receptors. Norepinephrine release from the nearby norepinephrine neuron acts on the receptors which decrease serotonin release. Thus, serotonin release is inhibited both at the serotonin autoreceptors and norepinephrine heteroreceptor acting at the brake system for serotonin. Similarly, along with 5HT receptor, there are alpha-1 receptors at dendrites and cell body, which increases release of serotonin. Thus acts as an accelerator in the cell body. Here mainly it acts as an accelerator, there it's as a brake. Certain roles, mainly peristalsis, vomiting, platelet aggregation, hemostasis, inflammatory mediator sensitization, central mainly control of the sleep, mode, hallucinations, stereotype behavior, pain, perception and vomiting. Next, dopamine. Dopamine is produced from the precursor molecule dopa. Dopamine is removed from the synthesis of specialized dopamine transmitter and catabolized by monoamino oxidase, catechol-1 methyl transferase. Dopamine mainly involved in motivation, reward, and reinforcement. Some addictive substances, especially stimulants and alcohol, work by affecting dopamine neurons. There are mainly important circuits, mainly tuberoinfundibular pathways, mesocortical pathway, nigrostriatal pathway, and mesolimbic pathways. Dopamine mainly receptors are D1 to D5 stimulate adenyl cyclase activity implicated in the cognitive functions such as control of working memory and attention. D2 like D3 and D4 inhibit adenyl cyclase activity implicated in mediating rewarding effects of drugs of abuse. Noradrenaline. Noradrenaline plays an important role in flight and fight excited of fight and flight excited neurotransmission and is implicated in motivation. When faced with severe stress response system activates rising norepinephrine and stress hormone. This increase arousal, increase insomnia, anxiety, depression, irritability, and emotional instability. Prolonged stress leads to underactivity of the stress response. This lowers arousal and results in low energy, daytime fatigue, and decreased concentration. So norepinephrine, principal function of at the locus coeruleus is the primary completing the incoming stimuli, whether external threat to the environment or the focus of attention. Glutamate is a principal excitatory neurotransmitter in the CNS. Glutamate is an amino acid that is produced from glutamine. Glutamate is removed from the synapses by transporters on specialized neurons metabolized to glutamate, then resupplied relevant neuron terminals. Glutamate is associated is an amino acid present in high protein diet, most prevalent in exercise. It's a prevalent neurotransmitters used to it is used to make GABA, activates learning and memory. Increase in glutamate leads to panic attack, anxiety, and impulsivity. GABA is found throughout the brain rather than being localized to specific areas or pathways. There are three types of GABA receptors, which, although varied, can typically be separated as follows: GABA A, GABA B, and GABA 3. C. Glycine is a major inhibitory neurotransmitter, has to be more localized and can be found in the spinal cord. Next, we'll talk about monoamine hypothesis in depression. The broad range of symptoms associated with major depressive disorder implicates several brain circuits and regions and multiple neurotransmitter systems. The three main monoamine pathways associated with pathophysiology of depression are serotonin, adrenaline, and dopamine. The monoamine hypothesis postulates that low activity of at least one of these neurotransmitters is responsible for the corresponding features of depression. However, because of the interconnectivity of CNS, an attempt to enhance the levels of single specific neurotransmitter may produce decrease in other neurotransmitters. The broad range of symptoms associated with major depressive disorder implicates several brain circuits and regions and multiple neurotransmitter system. The three main monoamine systems associated with pathophysiology of depression is serotonin, adrenaline, and dopamine. The monoamine hypothesis postulates that a low or abnormal activity of these neurotransmitters are responsible for corresponding features of depression. According to the classic monoamine hypothesis of depression, when there is a normal amount of monoamine neurotransmitter activity, there is no depression present. The monoamine hypothesis depression states that normal amount of neurotransmitter activity becomes reduced, depleted, or dysfunctional. For some reason, depression may ensure. Monoamine receptor hypothesis depression extends the classic monoamine hypothesis of depression, stating that deficient activity of monoamine neurotransmitters causes upregulation of postsynaptic monoamine neurotransmitter receptors, and that leads to depression. The neurotransmitters are connected functionally, and hence increasing one neurotransmitter may decrease other neurotransmitters, and vice versa, which is depicted in this slide. Depression associated with decreased level of BDNF factor. Stress is a risk factor for development of depression. Stress leads to depletion of monoamine neurotransmitters, disinhibition of hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, decreased level of BDNF levels of BDNF factors. Evidence points to the brain-derived neurotropic factor is a neurotropin that is vital for survival, growth, and maintenance of neurons as a key in the key brain circuits involved in emotional and cognitive functions. Inflammatory cytokines hinders neuronal synaptic plasticity, and decreased levels of neurotropic factors, mainly BDNF, and reduces neurogenesis in the hippocampus, can lead to depression. So, in 1950s and 60s, with the development of antidepressants medication, the monoamine hypothesis came to dominate psychiatric research. While being simple and elegant, that monoamine hypothesis ran into several difficulties ranging from lack of response to therapeutic latency period. The past 30 years, attention has slowly shifted towards inflammatory or cytokine hypothesis of depression. The hypothesis was first proposed by Smith in 1991 in the form of macrophage theory of depression. Mainly, cytokines participate in the innate immune responses and inflammation. Have important metabolic and endocrine effects, including neurotransmitter metabolism, neuroendocrine functions, and neuronal plasticity. The cytokine hypothesis of depression suggests that pro-inflammatory cytokines play a primary role in the mediation of pathophysiological characteristics of major depression, where inflammatory process may be induced by external or internal stress, such as psychological or inflammatory diseases. Pro-inflammatory cytokines are capable of stimulating 5-HT receptors from synapses. Increased levels of interleukin B1 and tumor necrosis factors activate the mitogen activator production kinase pathway, which enhances the activity of cell membrane transporter and the reuptake of neurotransmitters 5-HT, dopamine and norepinephrine, and this leads to the depletion of neurotransmitters, and it will lead to like symptoms of depression. Next comes kynurenine pathway. Pro-inflammatory cytokines can alter the mechanism of synthesis of serotonin. The degradation of mainly tryptophan, a precursor of 5-HT, through kynurenine pathway can cause reduction in 5-HT biosynthesis, and subsequent central 5-HT deficiency may potentiate the onset of depressive symptoms. Tryptophan degradation in kynurenine pathway produces metabolites of NMDA receptors. They may lead to altered glutamate transmitters that could trigger excitotoxicity, impaired neuroprotection, and development of depression. The HP axis is a major component in the connection between biophysiological response and environmental stress. Pro-inflammatory cytokines, particularly interleukin 6 and tumor necrosis alpha, are indicated to prevent the entry of cortisol glucocorticoid receptor resistance. 2. Cortisol results in glucocorticoid resistance, leads to steroid insensitivity and cortical hypersecretion, and the state of chronic low-grade inflammation, which has been implicated in the onset of autoimmune disease and depression. Neurodegeneration. Evidence points to the link between development of depression and neuroprogression mechanism, including neurodegeneration and reduced neurogenesis. Interleukin B has been indicated to alter the glutamate transporter expression, leading to decreased receptor glutamate, with excess of synaptic glutamate subsequent to NMDA mediated excitotoxicity and cellular damage, which can lead to depression. Already we have discussed brain derived neurotropic factors. Here, mainly increased inflammation can cause decreased antioxidant, which can lead to increased immune reaction. Subsequently, there is neurodegeneration, and this can lead to depression. Here, one more slide shows bidirectional relation between humoral circuitry of depression and inflammatory response. Here, seen a cytokine network, there is decreased serotonin, increased glutamate, and increased oxidative stress, and increased neurotoxicity, decreased BDNF, neurogenesis, and corticotropic releasing hormone. Again, there is a cycle, peripheral cytokines and inflammatory mediated responses. And then genetics. study of genetics of depression, it has long been thought that major depressive disorder has a genetic component based on data from family, twin, and adoption studies. Having a first relative with major depressive disorder increases the risk of being diagnosed with MDD by 2 to 2.84 times. In adoption studies, up to threefold increase in the rate of depression has been observed in the biological parents of a person with depression compared to adoptive parents. The heritability of major depressive disorder is approximately 40%. The genes implicated in major depressive disorders, apolipoprotein, 5-hydroxytryptamine, dopamine receptor D4, G protein subunit beta 3, 5-hydroxytryptamine, methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase, dopamine transporter 1. The 4E hypothesis, cumulative stressor could predict a depressive episode. Identifying a depressive and its causes, the mainly depression hypothesis mainly identifying depression and its causes. The origin of EAT hypothesis came after reading an article in 1990 that about 1 to 3 patients who came to the internal medicine physician suffered from depression. And extensive literature search resulted in more than 100 factors that are associated with an increased risk of depression. They grouped 100 factors into 10 categories and called ITs. The person who considered to have an active IT when he has she meets at least 1/3 of characteristics of a particular category IT. The presence of a medical diagnosis considered as an active IT. Of these 10, it's only genetic and developmental are not reversible. Most of the other reversible ITs are directly related to lifestyle choices. In Nedler study, they have found that the brain is resilient and can typically stand up to a combination of 3 risk factor categories and functions correctly. However, when the risk factors category is added, even in the healthiest person will often develop major depression. Neuroimaging may provide greatest hope for identifying depression. Initial studies examined the structure of the brain, particularly the size or volume of specific brain areas or regions using static images obtained by CT or MRI. The studies identified frontal cortex and hippocampus as potentially relevant brain regions in the pathophysiology of depression. The hypothesis that were supported by postpartum studies. fMRI and PET looked at the regional blood flow and energy metabolism in the brain. Diffuse intense imagery to assess the integrity of white matter tract and connectivity region of the brain. MR spectroscopy to assess differences in chemical component across the brain region. Ligand binding studies measure the density of receptors and monoamine transporters. Many studies using resting state or trait based PET on fMRI found depressed patient to have reduced metabolism in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and increased activity in the region of considered to the levels in the amygdala. Here in this slide, meta-analysis of striatum structure volume in patient with major depressive episode. The putamen and saccharate are part of the striatum were found to have reduced volumes in patient with major depression compared to controls. So in another study,
Sir, sorry to interrupt you, sir. Sir, we have crossed the 15 minutes time, so
Oh,
we're
last slide, madam. Last slide.
Sure, sir. Please.
Compared to controls, patients with major depressive disorder at smaller volumes, orbital gray matter and of the hippocampus. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Satish, sir.
Yeah. So thank you, Dr. Chandrasekhar. I know we overran a little, but it was quite engrossing. It was a complex topic to cover, Dr. Chandrasekhar, but you have done an excellent job in kind of giving us an overview of all the neurotransmitters, the mechanism, the roles. You took us back to the neuroanatomy and neurochemistry classes, the hypothesis and the pathways, including the structural brain abnormalities in brain. Very well explained. Thank you, Dr. Chandrasekhar. And this set the scene very well, the platform very well to move into the next topic, Dr. Kiran Kumar's topic, because whatever we learned right now in terms of neurotransmitters and pathways are extremely important in understanding the manifestations of depression, the course, the progression, and the prognosis, and the intervention that is necessary, so that we can specifically target those areas of the brain using specific treatment modalities. So Dr. Kiran Kumar is going to kind of share his knowledge in terms of how we're going to treat depression, how we're going to recognize what are the clear pathways, the evidence base behind it, and when it reaches complex stages of treatment resistance as well. Apart from pharmacological treatment, what are the other interventions that are helpful, including new updates in treatment of depression? So over to Dr. Kiran Kumar.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for and brief overview of the biology of depression by Dr. Chandrasekhar. I think my slides are visible, sir.
Yes, Kiran. Yes.
Yeah. So we'll go into the management aspect. Now, again, this is quite a huge topic to understand management, diagnosis, sequencing, what are the guidelines, what are the recent updates. So please note, as of now, since we have 15 minutes, I will just restrict myself to the treatment of major depressive episode in an adult population, not going into the intricacies and nuances of treatment in other population, particularly special population like children, peripartum or postpartum, or in case of geriatric. So it is a simple presentation on major depressive disorder treatment in usually adults. In webinar, we know that there are a lot of difficulties, but we will try to do some justice to this option. As a professional, we wear various hats, the hat of a clinician, the hat of an academician, the hat of a researcher, sometimes just of an educator. Today, I thought, let me not be much of a researcher where I will go on giving evidence on various guidelines. Let me wear the hat of a clinician along with you people and try to see in my next patient who walks into my clinic with depression, what is that I have in my armamentarium and how will I use these medications or other psychotherapeutic measures. We all know that the decade 1991 to 2000 was called as a decade of the brain, and the way we understand neuroscience is much more clear. And the etiology which has been described by Dr. Chandrasekhar, the stress diathesis model that we talk about, there are various precipitating factors, predisposing factors, perpetuating factors, and there are certain protective factors so that not all of us becomes vulnerable to depression. So there's a huge biopsychosocial model in the background, and we talked about a lot of biological amines that we are. We also know that there is significant interface between the gene and the environment, and it is just not monoamines, as Dr. Chandrasekhar noted. There's a gamut of lot of other pathophysiological factors that play a role in the etiology of depression. Now, why am I going to the details of this again is to make you understand that it's just not the monoamines today, but we have to probably target a lot of other pathways. So conceptually understanding, we have etiology of gene genetic interaction at one point. We have a pathophysiology, particularly neurotransmitter, inflammation, HPA dysregulation, etc. And we have various domains that we fit into the syndrome of depression. Now, what is important in this domains, I'm not going into the intricacies of the slide again, is that we have to probably recognize clinical phenotypes, because sometimes treatment of syndrome becomes difficult and treatment of clinical phenotypes is very, very important. And these phenotypes also helps in recognizing the choice of the medication. We all know that it's a shared pathophysiological pathway that occurs, and in the same pathway that is probably essential for a lot of other conditions, not only depression but diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, dementia, etc., which are also comorbid in a lot of our patients. So with this background, we know that depression has widespread prevalence, it has early symptom onset, and as Dr. Chandrasekhar pointed, there's a lot of genetic vulnerability, a lot of underdiagnosis and undertreatment occurs, particularly in our country where we have dearth of mental health professionals and resources. There are frequent recurrences in depression. There is inadequate emphasis on treatment, and also there is poor treatment adherence and stigma, which subsequently leads to a lot of brain degeneration, making depression a pernicious illness and a number one killer with respect to psychiatric illnesses today. So it is very, very pertinent that we understand how do we treat. And as Dr. Satish Ramaya was telling, not only pharmacological, today we have a lot of biological modalities as well as psychosocial modalities in our armamentarium today. We need to use them judiciously. So let us see how we treat our patient with depression using all these modalities. We all know the idea is to have an adequate response, and not only response, the patient should be in a state of sustained response or remission. So this will be the ultimate goal of treatment, irrespective of what modality that we are using. So we not only aim for response, but we also aim for recovery so that relapses, which is a defining feature of depression, is taken care of. Before I go into the various guidelines, let me clarify, and rather this clarification was given by APA itself in 2019 in one of its guidelines. Please note, guidelines are not intended to be mandatory or exhaustive and may not be applicable to every professional and clinical situation. So, clinician preference, the socio-cultural milieu of the patient preference, everything plays a role. However, what we have understood is in difficult situation, always go back to the guidelines. It will be the probably a ray of hope for you. So guidelines are not something that is a gospel truth, but definitely their guidelines are very important in taking care of our patients. Coming to assessment and evaluation, where we start the management process, these are from clinical practice guidelines by Shiv Gautam et al. From Indian Journal of Psychiatry in 2017. It requires some basic assessment. So as I told you, we are looking for clinical phenotypes. So history alone is very, very important in this process. We need to do an absolute physical examination, particularly looking for thyroid swellings, nutritional deficiencies, simple iron deficiency anemias can be picked up, an exhaustive general physical examination to look for comorbidities, a complete mental status examination to understand the current diagnosis, and then sometimes it can be probably debated, should we do a pigeonholing into an ICD system of categorical system of diagnosing, or should we put it into a dimensional approach of DSM? Both has its own advantages and disadvantages, and for the sake of uniformity and for making a diagnosis, pigeonholing into some of the classificatory systems that we use today is very, very important. Having a working differential diagnosis, understanding what is the severity, mild, moderate, or severe, what is the subtype, whether it is psychotic, non-psychotic, or specifiers like DSM, peripartum in onset, catatonic in presentation, etc., are very, very important to understand what kind of depression we are talking about. So areas to be evaluated include symptom severity and symptom dimension. Both are very, very important to understand the choice of the treatment. The continuation of basic assessment, comorbidity is very, very important. Sometimes we miss comorbidity, be it a second psychiatric disorder, be it a medical disorder, be it personality disorders, or most commonly substance use disorders. It's very important so that we can probably do a proper assessment and see where the patient fits in for modalities of treatment. The risk of self-harm or suicidal ideations is again very, very important, because whenever we are treating the patient, if the risk of self-harm is very high, there is severe suicidal ideations, the patient has active suicidal ideation, probably the modalities differ. That we will come to it a little bit later. Understanding socio-cultural milieu of the client, or where the DSM is emphasizing on cultural context, or we are making a cultural formulation, is extremely important. And we as clinicians know by this time, it is just not the patient, the socio-cultural milieu is very, very important. basic investigations, whatever is feasible, is definitely important to understand the baseline. Assessment of caregivers, what is their knowledge, what is their attitude, is very important. So these are all guidelines already given in IJP, but I'm again reiterating it, and we do in our clinical practice, but we have to do it in that order so that we don't miss out certain things. Ongoing assessment, just not making a diagnosis, whether the patient is adherent to medications, what are the adverse effects with medication, what are the disability, can we do something for the disability assessment, and then the rehabilitation. Everything is part of management. So here we have to evaluate the patient under all these headings. We can go into other assessment or additional optional assessment that we have the luxury in our medical colleges. We use a lot of standardized rating scales to understand the current state and also to see what is the effect of the treatment. Neuroimaging modalities, not in every patient, but in some patient, definitely when the patient is not fitting into the classical spectrum, as atypical onset, as late onset, atypical presentation, neuroimaging is very important whenever it is affordable and feasible. So with that, we go on to a treatment formulation. We understand what is the diagnosis. So treatment formulation, please note, it should be feasible. It should be probably, we need to understand whether when we can probably tweak that thing. So treatment setting, whether it is an OP or an IP setting, is extremely important. Modality of treatment, whether it is psychological, whether it is pharmacological or biological or a combination, should be understood. It can all be manipulated in the later part, but we need to come into some kind of an agreement before we start. We know in a real life setting, this is the study example, if there are 100 patients of depression, even after 4 sequential treatment, only 60% of them responded to treatment with some amount of remission. The rest 40% did not respond. So please note, whenever you're treating a patient with depression, probably only 20 to 30% of them respond to your first line antidepressant. Now, that is quite astonishing. That is quite challenging for us as mental health professionals. And it has been replicated in our real life situation using the study. Here in this presentation, probably I will concentrate much on the pharmacological agents and then brush upon a little bit of non-pharmacological or psychosocial interventions and a little bit on biological. Now, pharmacological, that's the most important armamentarium that we have in syndromal cases of depression. So I've consulted various guidelines. NICE updated till 2018, APA, the 2015 version for depression, CanMed currently in its third version after 2016, our own IPS guidelines of 2015 and 2017, and I've also consulted Australian and New Zealand guidelines. Now, it is very difficult for me to go through the intricacies of all these guidelines, but I'll try to touch upon what most of the guidelines is. I told you in the beginning, I'll be wearing the hat of a clinician today, so let us not go into the intricacies of those, but what they say is very important. Please note, for a person presenting to you with depression, irrespective of the age and gender, all clinical practice guidelines indicated selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors as the first line drug. But however, none of them did not specify which of these 5 drugs we will be using. Okay, so SSRIs in general, you can close your eyes and say these are the first line drugs for me. Selection of medications, we know that there are 2 important outcome criteria. One is efficacy. It should definitely be efficacious. It should be tolerable. In real life situation, we as clinicians know more than the efficacy, sometimes it's a tolerability that takes precedence, because otherwise you are going to lose the patient. So factors that determine the selection of antidepressant, again as per IPS guidelines, there are 2 broadly classifiable factors. One is patient specific factors and the second is the drug specific factors. So what are patient specific factors? Past history of response to that medication. Definitely, if the patient has a second episode and has responded to a drug, whatever be the drug, definitely that will be the choice now. Past history of adverse effects, whether there was any adverse event with the drug, whether the patient was able to tolerate it, is a deciding factor. Drug-drug interaction, if the patient has multiple comorbidity, is already on various medications, so you need to understand what are the various drug-drug interactions. Age of the patient, say younger patients on SSRIs might have sexual dysfunctions. Elderly patients with SSRIs might have hyponatremia. So you need to understand. Gender differences, like somebody of a female of reproducible age group on specific medication, say on paroxetine. Gender differences with respect to, say, zolpidem. So you need to be extremely careful with respect to these aspects when you're considering comorbidity, be it psychiatric comorbidity, be it personality, or be it medical comorbidity. You need to be aware. Patient preference, again, we are in a world where we are towards a client-centric approach, so patient preference has to be kept in mind. Other things which are drug specific, the side effect profile of the drug, the cost effectiveness of the drug, dosing strategy, OD preparation versus TAD preparation, type of formulation that we have. We have long-acting, sometimes atypical antipsychotics which are used in depression, can be used as oral preparation, injectable preparations, etc. Safety in overdose. This is very, very important because we have already been evaluating the patient for risk of self-harm. So if somebody has a very high risk of self-harm, giving them a drug which has a low therapeutic index like amitriptyline or any other TCA or a MAO might be determinantal. So you need to be aware of these drugs, these factors when you are selecting a drug. Now, this is the Australian and New Zealand CPG by Jin Mali et al. So if you look at the slide with respect to the efficacy and tolerability, if you look at the first part, which are usually the first line drugs, the SSRIs, the NASA categories, melatonergic agonists like agomelatine, NDRIs, and SNRIs, which are usually considered first-line drugs, you see that they're quite efficacious. They're also equally tolerable. If you look at the lower half of the slide, which is usually second-line drugs, the NARIs, TCS, and MOS, we see that they're equally efficacious. But unfortunately, it's the tolerability profile that distinguishes them or keeps them as a second-line drugs. So most of the guidelines, they say that SSRIs, NASA agents like mirtazapine, melatonergic drugs, they're good for efficacy and tolerability. Therefore, they're the first-line drugs. SNRIs, TCAs, MAOs are definitely the second-line drugs because of their tolerability use. Now, this again has been replicated in this famous Cipriani et al. Lancet study, which was a famous network meta-analysis of 21 antidepressants that we commonly use. Now, if you look at this slide, this is again quite famous. Most of the presenters would be flashing this slide. This is a network meta-analysis, and the size of the circle depicts the number of patients and the connections between the placebo or the active comparator arm. It requires the number of studies. So it was basically evaluated for efficacy and also acceptability. Now, what did the study say? If you look at this forest plot, most of the drugs, in fact, all of the drugs were definitely efficacious, ranging from an odds ratio of 2.13 for amitriptyline to about 1.37 for reboxetine. So if you look at the slide, you can close your eyes, probably put the patient on any of this medication because all of them are efficacious when you compare them to a placebo. But what about the tolerability? If you look at this slide of acceptability and tolerability, except for agomelatine and fluoxetine, the rest of the drugs slowly decrease in the tolerability to an extent where for clomipramine, the placebo was better compared to the active drug. So tolerability is very, very important. That's what determines which drug you're going to use. So once we have established these things, we know that there is a syndrome of depression. These are the factors. You have selected a first-line drug, probably an SSRI or sometimes an SNRI also. Some of the clinical practice guidelines also say that you can use drugs like NDRI and also amitriptyline as a first-line drug, but always you need to be careful based on the tolerability. Then you go on for an acute phase where usually it takes about 6 to 8 weeks. In general, the consensus is usually the patient starts improving by 2 to 3 weeks. If they don't improve, you need to be scratching your head. But most of them improve by 6 to 8 weeks. If they don't, then it goes on to the next phase. But if they improve, then we go on to the continuation phase for about 4 to 6 months, where the goal is to prevent relapse. And after that, if they are uneventful, we go on to a duration, a maintenance phase about 6 months or longer. The whole goal is to prevent recurrence. Now, this is very, very simple. If the patient is fortunate enough, it's the first episode, if it's into this is what happens. But we know that only 20% of patients belong to this spectrum or a phenotype of this which they respond. The rest 70 to 80% usually don't have this. So they go into a state of non-response. Now, I'm not going into the intricacies of what is non-response, what is partial response, what is treatment resistant, but probably this is what we are going to do as a sequence. So what happens if there's a no response? Always go back and review the diagnosis. You will definitely see you would have missed some cases of bipolar depression, which is very, very common. Almost 30% might have that. There might be some comorbid substance use disorders. There might be comorbid access to in the form of personality disorders. So always go back and review the diagnosis. If you are very sure it is depression, we are talking about a non-response to antidepressant, which is a first-line drug that you used, then we have certain treatment strategies. What is that? Increase dose. Now, most of the clinical practice guidelines recommend an increase in dose. Now, this is very, very important because drugs like venlafaxine have genetic predisposition because CYP is genetically determined and probably in some genetic metabolizers, the level might be less. We know that SSRIs have a flat dose response. So after certain dose, we need to increase the dose. So always go for an increase in dose, particularly after 4 to 6 weeks of treatment. Now, if you think that the patient is not tolerating the medications or you have not got the expected response to the medication, at least 50% reduction in an absolute scale like HAM-D, go for a switch or substitute. Now, how do we substitute? Is it the same drug? Is it the same similar medication from the same category, or it is a different category? Again, this is a little bit of a gray area. Most of the CPG says you need to have second, third, fourth. You can have a separate medication, like if you're started with SSRI, go for an SNRI, or you're started with an SNRI, go for an SSRI. Now, how do we switch? Either it can be a slow cross titration, which is better. Sometimes you just start and stop, which has its own advantages and disadvantages. Having a washout period, like if you're substituting a TCA with an MAO, having a washout period for about 3 to 4 weeks is better. But again, it has its own perils because you are risking worsening of a patient who was already non-responding. Combination strategies can also be tried, like an SSRI or a TCA can be combined. An SSRI can be combined with an SNRI, or say like the study, a venlafaxine and a mirtazapine can be combined. Combination has its own advantages, some disadvantages as well. Augmenting strategies are very, very important. This is what we do in clinical practice, augmenting with drugs like lithium, for which we have level 1 and level 2 evidence. There are a lot of evidence for atypical antipsychotics at low doses as augmenting agent. I'll come to it a little bit later. Or tested and tried hypothesis like having a T3 and T4 as an augmenting, or psychostimulants sometimes as an augmenting agent, can all be tried, but patient selection is very, very important. So today we have a whole gamut of antidepressants available, from the tricyclics and tetracyclics to the SSRIs, SNRIs, or to the modulators today that we have in the form of vortioxetine. So we know that it's just not the efficacy, it's the tolerability that is very, very important. That is where SSRIs and SNRIs or even NASA drugs probably predominate. So this is what I was trying to say. Antipsychotic as an augmenting agent, particularly atypical antipsychotic agents, are on the rise. But however, US FDA has approved the following ones: aripiprazole as an adjunctive treatment of MDD in adults, brexpiprazole as an adjunctive treatment in adults, olanzapine fluoxetine combination for both acute and maintenance phase in adults and geriatrics, and quipin XR, that is extended release, is being used as monotherapy in adults as adjunctive agent. Probably you'll be wondering why risperidone is missing. Yes, there's a lot of evidence, particularly level 2 evidence for risperidone, and probably in due course of time it will be used FDA approved. As of now, it is not, but definitely we use risperidone as an adjunctive agent. What study has told us is that not everybody remit, and if you see these meta-analysis studies from various authors, as you go from first line drug to probably 3 or 4th line drug, the response rate reduces, unfortunately. So if the patient has not responded in the first couple of drugs, you know that probably the patient is going towards resistance, and we need to understand why. We need to understand what is the phenotype and make some amends in our treatment. We also know that as we start on increasing with number of medications or number of modalities, when we go as a sequential alternative, we know that the patients drop out more and more because tolerability becomes an issue, and by probably the third 3 prior treatment failures, almost 41.4% are going to probably drop out. So it's going to be a double-edged sword. At one end, he is not responding, and the second end is dropping out because of tolerability issue. So it is going to be quite difficult. So these are some recommendations for certain dimensions of MDD that we see in clinical practice. Like somebody with marked anhedonia, SSRIs or SNRIs are the first-line treatment. Drugs like mirtazapine and agomelatine can be tried. Psychomotor retardation, again SSRIs or SNRIs. Sleep disturbances, I think SSRIs with an mirtazapine or an agomelatine is wonderful. Atypical features, SNRIs and SSRIs, definitely. Psychotic features, as I told you, combination with an atypical antipsychotic does wonders. Anxious distress, drug like SSRIs or SNRIs with an alpha-2 antagonist like mirtazapine. With high suicidal risk, drugs like SSRIs or SNRIs and an alpha-2 antagonist. So probably when you see SSRIs and SNRIs and a mirtazapine or an agomelatine are usually the preferred drugs. So if you want to probably summarize what are the recommendations from the various clinical practice guidelines, first line pharmacotherapy is SSRIs. Some of them say newer agents can also be tried, be it mirtazapine, be it agomelatine, but we will probably stick on to SSRIs. Evaluate the patient at 1 to 4 weeks, again varies by guidelines, some are 2 weeks, some are 6 weeks. See if dose increase needs, whether if tolerance issue, you can increase the dose. Evaluate the patient again by 2 to 8 weeks, again varies by guidelines. See for change of treatment, be it augmentation, combination or switch, especially if it is not tolerated. Adjunctive treatment, particularly the atypical antipsychotics, should be considered as a second line therapy. Continuation treatment can go on for about 4 to 6 months. Some guidelines say up to a year. For patients who require maintenance treatments, please note if it is a simple case, around 1 year. But if there are difficult episodes, if the patient started with psychotic episode, if there is various comorbidity, if the patient is already recurring and relapsing, the maintenance treatment can go on for 2 to 3 years. Some guidelines use the word indefinite. Some guidelines use the cutoff as 5 years. So again, there's a gray area. But as clinicians, we know if somebody is not responded, somebody is having recurrence, probably it will go on for indefinite length of time. Now, coming to psychological evidence, so this is what we are finished with sequencing with pharmacotherapy. We know that in mild cases, psychological therapies like CBT and IPT are preferred. For moderate to severe cases, it is usually used along with the first line treatment of pharmacotherapy. There are broad range of therapies available. I'm not going into the RCTs of these things, but CBT and IPT have wonderful the RCTs that replicate that they are definitely useful either as monotherapy or as combination therapy with medications. Other things like common sense problem solving approach, non-directive psychotherapy, behavioral activation therapy, self-control therapy, short-term psychodynamic therapy, and currently which is hugely successful, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and metacognitive therapy, they're all useful. But only thing is the expertise required, the time duration, and probably the cost effectiveness all play a role. We also have our age-old neurostimulation methods. In fact, they are the oldest biological therapies available in the form of ECT. ECT still has a role today. Please note it is not at the lag end of the algorithm in cases where the patient presents with severe depression, particularly with MAP, cachexia, high risk of suicide, catatonic presentation, previous good response to ECT, severe psychotic depression, or the treatment resistant depression. ECT still has a role. It is still one of the wonderful modalities. We have seen day in, day out in our practice, ECT works and the patient responds. Other stimulation techniques like RTMS is probably reserved for non-psychotic depression with failed medication trials. 15 to 20, sometimes 25 sessions does produce some improvement, but again, it's controversial. Other modalities of neurostimulation like DBS, vagus nerve stimulation, transcranial direct current stimulation have its own role, but probably in limited patient population, so it cannot be generalized. So coming to recent updates, what we have in armamentarium, a couple of slides before I wind up, vertioxetine is quite promising because it's a serotonin modulator and a stimulator. It is specifically indicated for MDD in the dose of 10 to 20 mg. It is US FDA approved way back in 2013, but still we are not using it much, but it is available in the market today in India and we have started using the medications. We'll see how it works out. Brexpiprazole, as I told you, an atypical antipsychotic with unique partial agonist activity and antagonistic activity is also an indicator for adjunctive treatment of MDD and also for treatment of schizophrenia. It was approved in 2015. It's trickling down in Indian market. I don't have personal experience. Probably we can have a discussion later on what is the role of brexpiprazole. One thing that I've been looking forward is drugs which probably NMDA receptor antagonists, particularly esketamine, because we know the role of ketamine. Now, esketamine in treatment-resistant depression, particularly as inhaled or transnasal approach is being examined. It has been approved, years of FDA approved in 2019. This is one molecule that I've been looking forward probably in treatment-resistant cases. So let us see how much it is going to be useful. So with that, I end my presentation. Thank you very much for this opportunity for Abbott, and I hand over the session to the chairperson. Thank you, sir.
So thank you very much, Dr. Kiran Kumar. It was really amazing that you took us through the journey of, I'm really quite impressed with that clinical hat presentation. So you really took us through the journey of patient coming in, how we comprehensively assess the patient, formulation, and then moving on to the treatment strategies based on, symptomatic presentations or various other factors. So thank you very much. It was very comprehensive and very enriching for all of us. So now I invite the attendees to post their questions in the Q&A box, or any comments or suggestions, or would people want to share their opinions about these clinical approaches. Feel free to share. So while we wait, I just have a couple of questions. Maybe I'll start off with this question to Dr. Chandrasekhar. Dr. Chandrasekhar, now you gave us a beautiful insight into the neurotransmitters and the pathways and hypotheses and all, and then Kiran Kumar just took us through the in terms of the treatment targets and how we choose the treatment. Now, as a clinician, how important for you to kind of understand the symptomatology of patient presentation and attributing them to all these neurotransmitters and pathways in deciding the actual treatment medicine, whether it's pharmacological or psychological approach. Is it clinically very important, or like Dr. Kiran said, in clinical practice, we go by various other factors, not just the neuromodulators and neurotransmitters. We also look at various like patient choice, families, knowledge, clinicians.
Sir, we lost you, sir. So is it possible to switch off the video, sir? Maybe we will be able to hear your voice. Now you're back. Yes, sir. Please go ahead.
Oh, you didn't hear my question at all?
No, sir.
The last part.
Oh, I'm so sorry. So, Dr. Chandrasekhar, okay, let me quickly ask the question. The question is, how important for us to understand the patient symptomatology in the context of all the neurochemistry and the pathways, hypothesis and pathways to determine the treatment? Or do we just go by our clinical experiences and patient choice, like Dr. Kiran was explaining in terms of efficacy and tolerability? Is it really important clinically, and how important it is? I think that Chandrasekhar, you have to unmute.
Hello.
Yes, yeah, please
Yes,
go
doctor,
ahead.
you're audible.
You able to hear? Yeah.
Yes, doctor, yes.
See, as Kiran told, it is very important to assess the patient, like in detail assessment. Accordingly,